By collecting the economic rent, we can stop humans from doing the two most damaging things we do, which is create inequality and damage the planet.
One of the things that psychologists have been saying more recently is that we don't believe things because they rationally make sense to us. We start off believing something intuitively, and then we construct a rationale to justify it.
Absolutely.
So that most of what we, the Age of Enlightenment was originally rational. If you look at the Enlightenment authors, they're making great references to biblical history and stuff, and they are saying, the Bible was right about this because, and it's like, here's the revelatory reason that is supposed to have come down from God, but here's a logical reason that says the same thing. And then at some point they started getting carried away with their own rationale, maybe with John Stuart Mill and some others, where they thought that they could construct things logically and that would give them the right answer. And what they didn't seem to realize, that modern psychologists realize, is that no, they started with what they wanted and then they constructed a rationale to justify it. And so if what they wanted was wrong, they could come up with an elaborate rationale to justify what was wrong. And it's interesting because the image Lucifer was the light giver, and that wasn't an Old Testament story. That's kind of a New Testament story that's retrofit to the beginning of time. But Lucifer was God's favorite because he was the brightest, and he was so bright that he started challenging God's wisdom, and God ended up banishing him. Well, that's a I don't take the Bible as literally true, but it's got great archetypal stories and metaphors, and that metaphor is like, okay, when we said, wait a minute, we can discover things logically and not have to rely on ancient superstitions, that you can fall into a trap of thinking that you're being logical when you're really just rationalizing your own superstitions, your own desires, and that they might not be as wise as you think they are, that whatever popped into your head might not be greater than the wisdom of the ages, even if the wisdom of the ages was not handed down from God, but was just something that evolved because generation after generation said, no, this works and that doesn't work, so we're going to drop that and we're going to incorporate this into our narrative. And so that maybe the religion itself was an evolutionary product. Brett and Heather Weinstein make the argument that all societies have religions, so the religions themselves must serve an evolutionary purpose, or there would be societies without them.
I think one purpose that they serve is that once we have language, what language gives us? It gives us a past and it gives us a future. It gives us a past tense and a future tense. And so because we can, one of the great, a linguist who's written a lot on the evolution of language, Derek Bickerton, he has what does he call it? Displacement. That the difference between language and communication is language has displacement. And with language, you can talk about things that are not immediately before you, things that have happened in the past and things that are going to happen in the future. Even in my dissertation, and I argued there was probably selection pressure for that in terms of female choice. A man who could promise a good life well into the future had a leg up over a man who just what he was doing in the here and now was all that he could sell. But I think once humans have the ability to imagine a world before we were born, and we can do that. I know there was a world before I was born, and we're aware that there's a world after we die. So humans have to confront our mortality in a way that other species do not. And that is a strong selection pressure for a belief in religion, because it's terrifying to assume you're going to die. Believe me, as I'm 84 now, the closer I get to, I know I'm past my sell-by date already. So I'm very, very aware that, yeah, there's something comforting about believing. It makes life more bearable. So I think that's a very strong selection pressure for religious thought. And for other things too. Language ability is a tricky stuff. The outside member on my dissertation committee when I was at Rutgers was at Harvard at the time I asked him to serve in that capacity, Bob Trivers. And he actually did the genetic research that was the basis for the field that was called sociobiology. And back in the mid, E.O. Wilson wrote the book called Sociobiology, but Bob Trivers did the genetic research on which those theories were based. And he was the outside member of my dissertation committee, and he introduced to me in conversation, and he has since written books about it, the human skill with self-deception and deceit. Those are his two terms, that humans are just brilliant at self-deception and deceit. And with language was born the ability to lie to ourselves and to others. I find all that fascinating. So, and we're so good, tribalism and greed to me are the species-specific traits we need to rise above. We really do. And a good place to start rising above them is to recognize, I'm as capable of doing that as anybody else is. Just ask yourself, when you see a talking head on television, a politician, and before you decide whether you believe how much credit you're going to give to his ideas, you find yourself going down to check to see whether he's got an R and a D after his name. I think most of us do. I often wish they didn't show the political affiliations of the talking heads, that, maybe we could get past it. In fact, at the very end of my book, I quote a line from Pogo, Walt Kelly, the cartoonist, his little possum, I think it was. We have met the enemy, and it is us. And it is. We are our own worst enemies, and we have to address our tribalism and greed and figure out how to rise above it. I think the Georgist solution is a good start, collecting the economic rent. And that's why I'm so glad this conference is so focused on the commons.
I got a question from Ed Dotson that says, some tribal societies continue to avoid hierarchy. Do you think this is possible once there is a significant division of labor?
Yes.
I don't know.
Are we answering the question? I think
Sure.
I think once there's a sufficient access to resources, a more egalitarian access to resources, I think you'll eliminate some hierarchy. But I think in terms of reproductive choices, I think humans are always going to have hierarchies. Males tend to arrange themselves in hierarchies. Women sit back and watch them fight it out till which one's at the top of the heap, and then women pick the guy at the top. So I think there is a selection pressure in favor of hierarchy. In fact, Bob Trivers, the same mentor of mine, he argued that systems of female choice tended to create male hierarchies. So that was his theory on that. But I think an egalitarian, distribution of resources takes the horror out of hierarchies.
I was at an American Indian conference. Well, it was they were headed to DC, and they stopped in Pittsburgh to promote their cause, and they said that they were Sioux Indians, and they said that they were a matriarchal society. And somebody asked, well, if you're a matriarchal society, why is it that all the chiefs are men and that all the people doing the talking are men? And he said, because the women chose us. that the American Indian matriarchal societies, that men were still put in charge of leading and making those tough and dangerous decisions, but the ordinary man had no vote. That the chiefs were chosen by the women, or in some cases the elders of the tribal council was chosen by the women, and then the chief was chosen by the tribal council. But in those so-called matriarchal societies, the women did not put themselves in charge. The women were in charge of deciding which men would be in charge. And I thought that was an interesting approach to things, because it ultimately, the women were in charge. When you're talking about the entire population of women were in charge, and the entire population of men could only attain power by winning the favor of the women.
Now, I bet, are there other questions, Dan? Because I've talked so much, I don't want to talk this past.
There's none in the Q&A. There might be some in the chat, because I'm trying to pull up the chat now. I don't see it.
I don't know. There's been some comment and things. So if you guys want
to put the questions in the Q&A if anybody has any.
While we're waiting, we might as well welcome our 23rd sponsor. Shepheard-Walwyn has become our 23rd sponsor for the year 2022. So we welcome you aboard and thank you. And Caitlin, one of you we have a discount on the book, correct? If you can put it into chat, that it would be nice. So, or you can talk, yeah. See, talk.
Oh, and Morella Lombardo is
my editor. I've been so lucky. I'll tell you, my publishing experience has been such a joy. Cannot tell you what lovely editors I've worked with. So
I'm looking for,
and Morella Lombardo.
I'm looking for her.
She's listed under one of the Caitlins.
Oh, okay. I don't. Yeah, in the chat that said that it would be good for her to talk some, but I don't. She's not listed as Morella Lombardo in
She's listed under Caitlin Tooth. We have a question.
Under Caitlin Shepheard-Walwyn?
Yeah, no, Caitlin Tooth. Jeremy Edwards has a comment. Can you please talk a little more about the 24 chromosomes theory versus the slow natural selection? I haven't heard anything about that before.
You know, who asked that question?
That's Jeremy Edwards.
Jeremy, I had not heard anything about that until, maybe 3 years ago. You know, once I discovered Henry George, I spent the next 20 years being a bit of an economic activist, serving on George's boards and so forth. And it wasn't until I moved to Massachusetts in 2008, and I'm very close to all the big universities like Harvard, MIT, the Radcliffe Institute, that my interest in evolutionary biology came roaring back. I'd neglected it for 20 years, and suddenly I can hop on the 77 bus and go in and hear the leading experts in their field discuss their new research. And one of the things I did is I joined the Science Book Club for the Curious, which is sponsored by the Boston Museum of Science. And one of the books we read, and this is like only 5 years ago, they had at the end, they had the paper in which the gentleman, Jorge Yunus and Prakash, had compared great ape chromosomes to human chromosomes. Now, great apes have 24 chromosome pairs and humans have 23. Now, how do we go changing the number of chromosomes? That creates a whole new species. And they looked at the genes on the different chromosomes and discovered that if you took what they now call, of course, because we're so anthrocentric, we now call it just chromosome 2, and we say that the great apes had chromosome 2A and 2B. Those two chromosomes combined end to end. Very, very unusual. The telomeres at the end of the chromosomes usually prevent those kinds of end-to-end chromosomal fusions. And I think in most cases, they would be deleterious, just like the more usual kinds of mutations are what we call non-disjunction, where more horizontal chunks of chromosomes stick to each other, or a chromosome might be duplicated. And if it happens, it's, as I say in my book, not all chromosomes are created equally. Some are more likely to be subject to episodes of non-disjunction, like chromosome 21. We give syndromes to the names, like Down syndrome. But there are others that don't happen often enough to even be given a syndrome name. And very often body-wide changes accompany those chromosome failures to separate or duplications. It's not just one or two genes that's impacted. So that's apparently reason, but I say that, to me, in the preface of my book, I say that end-to-end chromosome fusion ought to be headline news. The names of those two gentlemen who discovered that ought to be household names. And I've joked they're not even household names in my household because I have difficulty pronouncing names that I don't hear often. But yes, they documented that our second chromosome appears to be a result of an end-to-end fusion between two grade 8 chromosomes. And that is the difference that's made all the difference. And I think the only reason that we don't talk about that is, again, this anchor bias where we accept the gradual, steady change. How can that Darwinian paradigm possibly explain a reduction in chromosome numbers? That's a real big one. You know,
so those two chromosomes became one very long chromosome?
Well,
I mean, is it almost the same length as the original?
You know, I'd have to go back and look at their paper. I don't remember that, Dan. You know, but yeah, it's the result of a fusion. And a Spanish researcher, Manuel Ruiz Rajan, I think his name is. He's the one that speculated that the genes at the point of the fusion are the ones most likely to be impacted when such a chromosome fusion occurs. And he's the one who said that those are the genes that affect the gonads and the neurons. So to me, that's sex in the brain. And I think that's where concealed ovulation, that's the source of concealed ovulation. And I think it's also the source of some change in the way our brains can process information, that symbolic communication, that's language, which language is. Homo sapiens starts here. I mean, it's language that defines us. It really is. So that was a long answer. I'm sorry, but I'm glad someone asked that question because I find that to be completely and wonderfully fascinating, and not enough people talk about it.
So,
let's see. We have in the chat that we should say that most people can see it. The code Henry, all caps, 20 can be used on the Shepheard-Walwyn website to order Heather's book, and that's www.shepheard-walwyn.com. And so please do order the book instead of supporting Amazon and Jeff Bezos. Support the fine people at Shepheard-Walwyn.
And isn't it wonderful how they've always supported Georgists and people with these?
Yeah, it's really terrific.
Yes. I feel
my understanding is from Anthony Werner, when I guess he was the head of it at the time, he said that they made money on other books in order to subsidize the Georgist books.
Mhm.
So
Well, I hope my book earns some money for them. I've never cared much about money myself. I'm kind of that rare woman who's not even attracted to rich men. But I would really like to see this publisher be rewarded for how wonderful they've been to those of us who have ideas that fall outside the mainstream, and are hoping to improve the world. So yeah, I'm very, 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 very hoping. I'd love to work hard to make my book succeed. I'm not going to live long enough to enjoy any economic gain from it, but I'd love to see my publisher do really well. I have to tell you that.
Ed Dotson has another question. Do any of the women in the dissertation, your study, I think he means your dissertation study, expressed views about promiscuity, about their desire to have a few or more or many sexual partners? She and I were talking about how we selected our mates earlier. It was interesting. So go ahead.
I don't recall that, but of course the main thing I was asking them to talk about the existing men in their lives. However, one reason I decided to do that study, I will tell you, was conversations with female friends who were married, who acknowledged that they felt they'd married their husbands, they picked them for certain reasons. So how come now, 7 to 10 years into the marriage, they're finding themselves with wandering eyes? And that was a question that people raised with me. And I've never wanted to work for university. I've only ever returned to graduate school when I had a question that I couldn't get answered in books. And so I started looking in books for the answer to that question. And when I couldn't find it, I thought, oh, well, I'll go back to grad school and I'll do research. I'll ask women. And but not the women that I was interviewing so much. No, they were mostly talking about the men in their lives. No.
Do you think that if you were to do your study now, she told me earlier that she doesn't have the files, that you would get the same results with the younger women?
I look at younger women and I'm just completely bewildered by their sexual behavior, I must confess. I'm not sure what kind of results I would get. I really almost feel Caitlin Flanagan, a writer for The Atlantic, I quote her in my book, excuse me. She once said, when she listens to young women talk about their sex lives, she understands the language, but it's as if she's listening to people from another planet.
I have to agree. It's different. I can talk to my college classmates, and yeah, we still are on the same wavelength about our rebellion in the late 60s, early 70s. But we sort of look down and say, where are these young women coming from? Don't they understand what they should be doing? It's totally different.
Well, as I mentioned in one of the early chapters in my book, one reason for writing it, in addition to the concern about climate change, that was really my main driver. I thought, wow, the Georgists have an answer to climate change. And I care so much about it that I really need to get this book written. But the other reason was I don't know many young women who are particularly happy with their romantic or sexual lives. In fact, when I went to one of the conferences at the Broad Institute in Cambridge, and they had a reception afterwards, and there was a young woman at my table who, when she learned what my research interest was, she began to talk to me about how confused she and her friends were. She said, we went up and asked the guy, just told him we wanted to have sex with him, and he told us no. And I thought, oh my goodness, they need to read my first book, because that's putting veto power into the hands of the men. The answer is either yes or no. Darling, you have to go through a whole lot of steps first to come to his attention, to make him see you in a certain way, to let him know that you find him desirable. You've missed all the preliminary steps in taking yourself to what I consider kind of the default way of instituting a romantic encounter.
Let's see. Jim Frederickson has a question. The late Barry Commoner once said, in less technologically advanced societies, children are an economic asset, while in more technologically advanced societies, children are an economic liability. Do you think that that observation at least partially explains lower birth rates in technologically advanced societies?
Yes, I think it does, but we invest a lot in children in technologically advanced societies so that they're able to succeed. We still want our children to succeed. You know, the goal of reproduction is to get your own genes into the gene pool of the next generation. And those of us who invest heavily in a few children do that. So, you know, I think children in technologically advanced societies, we may not need support from our children as much, but we are still concerned with getting our genes into the gene pool of the next generation. And in technologically advanced societies, we can do it by having fewer children because their likelihood of surviving is much greater.
We have a lot of institutional things that we didn't necessarily overtly decide that they would change our family dynamics, but they do. And one is Social Security. You know, Social Security is that prior to Social Security, your children would look after you in your old age. So you invested in them when they were young, and then they invested in you when you were old. And families were more cohesive so that, you know, grandpa or grandma would live with the family. And there's a lot of things like that we have institutionalized things, and they're not necessarily bad. I mean, Social Security is not a bad thing, but it's got those unintended consequences that we never really considered, I think, or some people considered them and they were dismissed.
It's sort of like, oh, why does your grandpa live with you? Now everybody's moving back in because of the economics, because of debt. Yeah. So it's the reverse.
Now the old people are living with their kids, but they're still taking care of their kids.
Yeah, but sometimes it does reverse. Sometimes it is the reverse where the children are in their 60s and 70s and they're taking care of mom and dad who are in their 90s. I just was talking to a friend I hadn't seen in a couple of months from exercise, and she has been babysitting her mother-in-law who has dementia but does not realize she has Alzheimer's, and they're waiting to get her into memory care, and they can't leave her alone. If they walk to the kitchen, mom follows. So she's got to have 24/7 care. So it's taken a toll on the family, but they are with her. Frankly, hey, I'm a mom. I'm not a mom. I don't have kids that can watch her. It will be my 2 nieces and my 2 nephews that would come to my aid, or friends, hence that would come if I all of a sudden got Alzheimer's. So the extended family has had its uses and now has its uses. We downplayed it for probably a generation, and now it's coming back.
Well, the other thing that's a very Georgist thing, of course, housing costs are so completely out of control that of course young people come back and are living with their parents. And you know, the 3 things that have escalated the inflationary pressures are housing costs, healthcare, and education. Those costs are just through the roof. And so the fact that they are, you know, the inflationary pressure on those 3 things is so great, does change family dynamics. I mean, when I was in college, I could put myself through college with the money I earned summers as a car hop at Smitty's Drive-In. No kid today could put themselves through college working as a car hop at Smitty's Drive-In. Nobody. And I went to a state university. I went, my undergraduate work was at Penn State, but no, you know, so there are costs that are out of control.
Yeah. As I was working with a young woman today, she has 3 jobs to support herself. Tom Rossman commented, childcare is also a part of the affordability crisis. And then Jeremy Edwards comments, everything is unaffordable. He also asked about, based on your Rutgers thesis, were there any non-obvious factors women selected for? I'll add beauty is definitely not the only thing men select for.
I think he's right in that. Of course he's right. So his question was,
what non-obvious factors? Something that's beyond the surface.
Nothing that really surprised me. I thought it was interesting that if a woman had existing children from another relationship, the thing that she rated the most highly desirable trait in a man she was currently dating was whether or not he was good to her children. So good to her existing children was one, but that's quite understandable. But, you know, I wasn't necessarily expecting that. I'm trying to, you know, pretty much, you know, there weren't a lot of surprises. And women didn't just start out by saying, oh, I was attracted to him because he was rich. They would just, I'd say, well, what turned you on? What made him sexy? Oh, he had the gorgeous leather jacket. He had this little Mercedes convertible, you know. I would code that as control of material resources, as contributing, even though she's not saying money. The funniest one, though, and I told this story other places, but I find it entertaining, so I'll tell it again. I tried not to lead my subjects. I tried not to coach them too much, to just let them talk. In fact, I even learned not to say, oh, that's interesting, because if I said, oh, that's interesting, I'd get a flood of information in that same vein. But the very end of doing my interviews, I was down to the last few and I was tired. I've been talking to this woman for a long time. She was married to an airplane pilot, and she described him as the sexiest man in the world. And I said, oh, wow, that's pretty high praise. What traits contribute to that? And she was so embarrassed. She couldn't think of a single thing. She's going, oh gosh, let me think. I said, well, think about the last time you were just flooded with that kind of emotion, feeling desire for him. What was it that he did that inspired that reaction in you? And she said, oh, I know, she said, he brought me 2 pineapples. He brought me 2 fresh pineapples. He'd been on a flight to Hawaii. And at that moment, I saw a little lizard scuttering across my brain with an insect in its mouth to feed to the female. And I thought, oh my God, courtship feeding in humans. I had paid no attention to it. So this was a surprise. Luckily, when women started talking about menus they'd had 25 years ago, oh, I had the scallops wrapped in bacon, and he had the shrimp scampi, and I had Caesar salad, I stopped listening. I found it boring because, you know, going out for dinner is sort of a part of the dating ritual. I stopped paying attention, but luckily the tape recorder was still paying attention. So I went back through all my dog-eared transcripts, and I color-coded them. You know, I had different colors for control of material resources, control of social resources, intelligence, all those standard things. But nowhere was I coding for food. But there was food everywhere. I may have stopped listening, but the tape recorder kept listening. Not so much the fact of just going out to dinner. Of course, that's part of our dating ritual for a reason, I think. Women remembered the meals they'd had before she had sex with a man for the first time. And it didn't have to be a fancy meal. One woman was seduced by half a chocolate chip cookie. Of course, the man had baked the chocolate chip cookie himself. While she was doing dishes, he reached behind her and fed her a cookie that he'd already had a bite out of. So, but food immediately before sex for the first time. So I think I can honestly say that I'm the person who documented courtship feeding in humans. So that was, there's an answer. That was a surprise finding, courtship feeding in humans.
Ed Dotson has another question. When women have an opportunity for status beyond bringing children into the world, is this not a reason why women delay having children or choosing not to have any children at all?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think so. You know, again, I say in the book, and I believe absolutely true. One of my mentors, Lionel Tiger at Rutgers, had this saying that I think is absolutely true. Biology is not destiny, it's statistical probability. And you can't look at any one woman and expect her to behave in the way that, you know, the overall prediction would be. And so, yes, I think absolutely a woman can decide not to have children because she has career goals and so forth. Women who have children make it's very, very difficult to have the same kind of careers that men have traditionally had, particularly if they have large numbers of children. I saw, I think it was in the, I forget which of the newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, a study of, oh no, I can't remember where I read it. I read it today. They had a list of how different it is for women before Roe v. Wade and post Roe v. Wade in terms of their achievement in every kind of area, you know. So yeah, and yes, women make decisions for a variety of reasons. And not everybody has to have children. That's you can rise above that if you don't.
You were talking about selection, and I was thinking, you know, women have this list of things they look for in a man, and I was thinking, what's the list of things that men look for in a woman? And all I could think of was interested. You know?
I think
if she's interested, then I'll talk to her, and if she stays interested, I'll get more and more interested in her because she's interested. I think men are much simpler that way.
Yeah, I think so too.
Tom Rossman over here in chat said, he said that, yeah, let me read this, pull this back up after. Okay, I'm back here. Let's see here. Come on, it went down. I had a minute ago. Okay, here we go. It's almost there. And let's see, here it is. Oh, excuse me. Okay. Tom Rossman said, Dan Kahanan introduced the theory induced blindness, similar to the framing bias. And David Hume, reason is and ought only to be a slave to the passions. Just an interesting comment.
That is an interesting comment.
Yeah. Jeremy says again, Georgism plus challenging authority plus intelligent plus beauty.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, let's see if we have anybody else. Oh. Anybody have any other questions? We can tell you that this Saturday, we continue this conference with Nick Tiedemann of Virginia Poly Institute. He's going to be talking about the recovery of the Creative Commons, talking about intellectual property as enclosures of the commons. He says
that's going to be fascinating. I can't wait to hear next.
Yeah, that'll be at 2:00. And
on Saturday,
on this Saturday, the 11th, and next Tuesday, we're going to have the gang from Baltimore Thrives, which is Alana Hartzog, Vanessa Beck, Lorenzo Castaneva, and Michael Mara. I really have to hear what Mike says because he's got the thing cows, which is the analysis of the Baltimore Thrive Project, challenges, opportunities, weaknesses, and strengths. And so, interesting titles. So these are among the 11 different webinars we'll have.
Thank you for watching this video. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are in the description box. So please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's surprisingly helpful in getting our ideas out. So until next time, keep reading.